We've started stream right now. Have a nice conversation.
Thank you. Selam Şebnem.
Alaikum assalam, Yasmin.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Alhamdulillah. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting, and it's so lovely to see you. So we will wait just a little bit for people to log in. It usually takes a little bit of time. And in that time, we can just maybe talk about London and how the weather is there today.
Oh, it's been so beautiful, so hot, a little bit muggy.
Mm-hmm.
I have a sweet, tiny little garden where I just planted 2 magnolia trees.
Sounds lovely.
Do you know magnolia flowers?
I do.
Yeah.
I love it.
And so they're just planted, so they haven't flowered yet.
Great.
But I'm already dreaming of what they're going to be like.
Oh, please share photos later.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Spring and summer. Right. Okay. I will be following the comments on my phone, so I may look down at times. Okay. How are we doing? Right. Okay. I think we can maybe make a start now.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to welcome everyone. It's so nice to see so many numbers already on our live stream. Welcome. I'm really excited about today's program. We're going to discuss a different therapeutic model today, Islamic counseling. And I have a very special guest. Before I go on to introduce her, let me introduce myself for people who don't know me. Some people do, but I guess most people who click on today won't know who I am. So I'm Yasemin. I'm a psychotherapist. I studied psychology in London, and after graduation, I've continued my studies and training as well as education in psychotherapy. I have a background in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and also Islamic counseling, which we will go on to, hopefully. I can say that throughout my counseling journey and knowing that psychology is a vast world, and being a very curious person, I have continued my trainings, and recently I've completed hypnotherapy, and currently I'm training in journal therapy, which is also another fascinating area. I lived in London for a long time, and for the past 8 months I've been in Istanbul. I've been living here, and I work with English-speaking and Turkish-speaking clients. So now let me introduce my guest speaker, Sabnum Dharamsi. So Sabnum is a practicing therapist. She co-founded Islamic Counseling Diploma. It's in 25th year now, Sabnum?
Sorry?
It's in 25th year now, isn't it?
20, I can't quite hear you.
It's in the 25th year now, the Islamic
that's right.
Diploma. Yeah. It's been a long time.
Yeah, since 1997.
1997, that's a very long time. And it's the first accredited Islamic training in the UK, I believe, right? Yeah. So Sabnum's currently focuses on teaching students in Islamic counseling up to practitioner level, right? And this includes placement with GP surgeries and other organizations. And I'd like to mention that I had the privilege of being taught by Sabnum. I was her student for 3 years, and it was an amazing journey for me.
Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you, Sabnum. So Sabnum is currently developing a training program to help community activists to support people whose mental health is suffering because of COVID-19. Would you like to add anything to this introduction, Sabnum? Have I missed out anything?
Lovely introduction, Yasmin. Thank you.
Okay. So in that case, we can go on to the questions. So we will be touching upon COVID-19 and how it has impact on lives and perhaps some things that can help. So please stay tuned. But just to note that we will be answering questions at the end. So if anyone has questions, please make a note of those. You can start writing them, but we'll spare some time at the end, maybe 15, 20 minutes to answer those. And you can also give feedback in comments as well. We'll be reading them, and we'll answer questions as best as we can. If we can't make it through this at this program, we will try after the program as well. But to start with, I have been getting lots and lots of questions about what Islamic counseling is. When people hear it, they often say, oh, do you give advice like an imam? So do you give Islamic advice? Do you talk about ayats and hadith? People don't always know what we are talking about. So my first question is, when we hear Islamic counselors, or when we hear Islamic counseling, how can we describe it? How would you describe it? What would you say Islamic counseling is? And, or perhaps what isn't Islamic counseling?
Thank you, Yasemin. And before I start, can I just say welcome to everybody that's joined us. I appreciate it. It's always, I think, a huge gift when you have people's hearts that are open to this, and it transforms the conversation when people are longing to hear about something that maybe goes beyond the ordinary and the unexpected. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In relation to your question, I think it's probably the question that I get asked the most. And I want to take a little bit of time, if I may, on discussing this, but stop me if I go on for too long, because I'm not going to keep an eye on the time. I'll let you do that.
Okay.
But firstly, in relation to what you're saying, what it isn't about giving advice. We're not scholars. We're not imams. We don't give Islamic advice.
Mm-hmm.
That's a different field, I would sort of say.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it works is that every single counseling model is based on different philosophies. We all want well-being, but what does that mean? What does well-being mean? Is it just about feeling better? Is it just about stopping pain? Is it to make us more able to accept and cope with the madness of the world? You know, there have been some challenging writers who've written about therapy, and they say that it's just to stop you complaining, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
More recently, there's been a lot of developments in the field of neuroscience. So is it about telling us about brain regulation, about soothing the chemical self? Or is it the way that we think about something and changing the way that we think? Is it about meaning? Is it about something deeper? So with each counseling theory, rather, it has a different perspective. And sometimes they overlap. And indeed, with Islamic counseling, there's a lot of overlap with some of those perspectives that I've spoken about. But I think that maybe the key thing about Islamic counseling is that we look for a deeply spiritual perspective in amongst that. And it's an approach which values that aspect of our beingness. So, for example, Allah says in the Quran, we have the potential to be higher than the angels, or we can sink lower than the animals.
That's so good.
So if we look at ourselves, we can see that usually we operate along a whole spectrum of consciousness. Sometimes we are really, and sometimes we know in our hearts that we have gone beyond maybe the average, the ordinary, and we've elevated ourselves. So with Islamic counseling, we're really trying to vibrate with those higher levels of consciousness, with connecting to that unseen aspect of us, which we can't really define behaviorally or logically necessarily, but which is there. You know, when we speak about what is the flavor of love, what's the flavor of courage, what is it that makes us deeply at home in ourselves? Not just our conditioning, what we were brought up with, not our habits, but something beyond. So maybe that's a way of talking about Islamic counseling.
It sounds so rich. It sounds really rich.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, in our teachings, you know, I've said about every counseling model has different philosophies. And we would say that in the Quran, you know, we call them our teachings, right? They're revealed knowledge. So they have a different quality maybe to philosophies.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, perhaps we can say that that knowledge is eternal, that it spans across different time, different generations. And when Allah says to us that He never changes the state of a person's heart unless they first change themselves,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in our model of Islamic counseling, we understand that change has to come from within, you know, but usually we're so mixed up, we're confused. And so to open up to a therapist, and this is the same with all models, to open up to a therapist, when you feel vulnerable, you have to feel safe. And one of the huge aspects of safety is to know that the therapist does not have an agenda which is other than yours. You don't want somebody projecting their rubbish onto you. So for that, the therapist needs to really work on themselves. But to work on yourself, you have to understand the nature of yourself, and you have to aspire to the higher aspects of yourself. Otherwise, we just multiply the rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
So with Islamic counseling, we really try and train people to understand tawakkul, to understand reliance on Allah, because life is always going to throw us spanners, and we'll always get sides, I don't know what's the word, exploded or smashed up or disturbed, you know, by those things. And it's only by genuine reliance on Allah that the therapist can be clear enough and still enough to orient themselves towards the client, to put themselves in service of somebody else, and to really hear where they are for them, but not just any old them, the higher them.
Mm-hmm. So it seems that it is more for the therapist's journey, for the therapist's growth. That's my understanding from the training and also from what you're explaining. So it's not about giving Islamic advice. It's not about telling someone what to do or what not to do, but it's about being there, being in that stillness of the heart, being present and listening with judgmental. That's the main thing. That's the feeling.
Yeah, and you know, Yasemin, with when we talk about these things, often people that haven't experienced Islamic counseling sort of feel like, yeah, well, I get that. That's very easy. But what are your techniques? Yeah. And there are techniques, but really we focus on character, the character of the therapist. The Prophet ﷺ, you know, he said, Deen is nothing except character development.
Yeah.
And that thing of really consciously working on yourself is really important, because when you're then with somebody, they feel safe, they can open up to you, and they also start to resonate with that and appreciate that, because it touches us, you know. And I'm not saying that an Islamic counseling therapist is perfect by any means. But the training is very much focused on the being that you are and on the being of the client, rather than hiding behind, which I think sometimes with therapists, we do that as well, hiding behind a technique.
Yeah.
It means that you can be really raw with the person, and you can face, you know, one of the most difficult things to face in life is the inherent insecurity that there is in the dunya. And to be able to really be with uncertainty and give it permission is important for our heart's education. You know, we call that journey of life, we call it tarbiyah.
Yeah.
And Allah says to us, we come from Allah and we return to Allah, by Allah, through this life.
Mm-hmm.
And that tarbiyah, in our training, we really encourage the therapist to sort of hear the problem, hear the issue, but also try and hear the wisdom behind it. What is this trying to teach the person? And we're not going to sit there and sort of say, oh, I think this, you know, like really this is trying to teach you this, because that isn't appropriate at that moment. But we try and keep a flag out for that tarbiyah, we, you know, for the wisdom that's going to come, for the real development of that person through life, to have an eye on the journey.
I think that is very important, to meet the person where they are with their pain, with their distress, with their difficulty, not jumping to what we know, but holding our own truth, our own reality, but meeting them where they are and just validating their feelings, just being there with them, just holding their hands and pacing according to their journey. That's what I loved most during the training as well, when we could just slow them down if need be, maybe sometimes pausing, sometimes just maybe stopping, sometimes maybe fastening, but all depending on what the client needs, what the person needs, and seeing that situation as it is for their own reality and being that clear mirror. Right, so what you said there about what the world brings, I guess that can take us nicely to our next question in terms of COVID. So for the last few months, we've been all going through collective grief. There's collective grief in the air. We're dealing with distress and lots of changes in our lives. Some people have taken it okay, some not so well. There has been lots of ups and downs, lots of difficulties, uncertainty for sure. So we never really thought we would face such a thing as lockdown or quarantine. And as a result, people have faced isolation. So what reflections would you like to share with our listeners on isolation and COVID?
I mean, what you said really like resonates with me, because, you know, it's happened to all of us, hasn't it? And I keep saying to myself, my God, what happened? You know, what happened to the world that we knew? It's just like in the blink of an eye, just all the things that we're doing, you know, the children going to school, going to work, meeting people, going for a coffee, going to a museum, cutting your hair, you know, having your hair cut. Like there's so many things on social media out there about, oh no, I can't get my hair cut, you know, but also all the homeless people, you know, what are we going to do about that? And looking at how each country has responded to the fear and the vulnerability in different ways.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of my reflections has been that, you know, here in sort of developed countries, we've suddenly had to face very closely that idea of death and sickness. And not only death and sickness, you know, I think that the really hard thing has been to see right up close how, you know, you could die, or someone that you love could die, and they might be on their own, and you might not even be able to say goodbye, or people might not be able to say goodbye to you.
Yeah.
And so it's really made us face how starkly alone we could be.
Yeah.
You know, and it's made us face how so much of our identity has become attached and dependent on things, on people that are not reliable.
Yeah.
And we start to feel, many people have started to feel very unhinged, you know, literally unhinged, because those things were the things that were making us feel we were somebody.
And all of a sudden we became nobody.
Yeah. And also, you know, we've sort of said lockdown, you know, and I think that the whole aspect of having restrictions, of being restricted, has been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you know, we've been forced to live a very island life, you know, to really sort of be right in our homes, you know, with the people that we're with, or with no people, if that's where we are. Mm-hmm. And really to be in a kind of enforced retreat from the world. Mm-hmm. It was so interesting that it kind of came with Ramadan as well.
Yes.
And I've seen how, you know, it's really made some people sort of say, actually, I know there's this suffering, but I'm so relieved to have peace and quiet. I'm so relieved not to have all this social pressure. I'm so relieved not to be in all those political conversations at work. Mm-hmm. You know, and I actually feel better. And some people have sort of said, you know, I'm now seeing how corrupt our leadership is, how, you know, different countries' leaders have responded differently. And it's really highlighted some of the corruption that there is there, and what those leaders maybe are interested in, which is, you know, sometimes we'll sort of, we kind of feel like, well, that's not the people. So it seems that lots of things are being really shaken up, our own identities, and a lot of reflections on the world, how it is and how we want to live through it. And I really also have been very moved by the amount of volunteering that's going on, the amount of care, the amount of love, you know, from key workers, but also, you know, people beyond that sphere. How, you know, people have really respected this gift of life and connection. Mm-hmm. Also, like, I've been laughing, you know, there's been so many funny things on TikTok,
so much creativity,
and, you know, hilarious things. And it's just like you see the human spirit also, you know, emerging. So I hope, and maybe I'm deluded, but I hope that, you know, this is really giving us an opportunity, you know, with the greatest respect for all the deep suffering that there is, to really take up what's being offered as well in all of this. You know, something maybe for our hearts that we wouldn't have got without this. We wouldn't have understood without this.
That's such a beautiful way of looking at it, and it's such a beautiful reflection, Sabnum. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, there is so much to take away from that. It, I guess, also depends where we are and where we were before this, before it hit us. And yes, definitely an opportunity if we can see all those different aspects to it. So this follows onto my next question. There is a lot of fear around COVID, understandably. And COVID has quite negative, it has negatively impacted people. You talked about well-being in the beginning, you know, is it well-being? Is it this, is it that? So there has been negative psychological implications. What advice do you have for people who are overwhelmed and struggle to contain themselves during these difficult times? Yes, some people see it as a maybe reward, they can stop and they can rest, but others who are already struggling with the anxiety and distress before the COVID, it has hit them harder.
Yeah.
In terms of containment, in terms of anxiety in people who are really overwhelmed, what would you like to say?
I actually was thinking about this question before, Yasemin, and I don't know if I've actually got a little PowerPoint slide that I can share, if that's useful. Let me see if I can.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay, I can't, but it's okay, I can talk to it.
Okay.
It's
I
fine.
think there's also been a question. There's a question about how we really exactly work with Islamic counseling. We're going to come to that.
Sorry, Yasmin, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah? Is that better?
Yeah. I missed the question.
I was just saying that there's questions that are also coming in the meantime. And there's a question about what are the most common problems you treated in terms of, we're talking about distress and overwhelmed people who are struggling with fear and difficulty at this time. So I guess it will. Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit.
I don't know what's happening.
Mm.
I can hear you well.
You can hear me well? Okay, so I'll try and continue.
Okay.
So in terms of the sort of things that people are experiencing, one of the things that I would like to share is that I think that in this time, you're right. It's an exacerbator. So whatever was already there, it's multiplying it.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly when there has been childhood trauma, we know that when there is childhood trauma, that the brain can get flooded, and this is where the neuroscience comes in, that the brain can get flooded with cortisol and it affects brain development. But we also know that the brain has a lot of plasticity. In other words, we have the capacity to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways in which you can experience healing is through the mirror of others.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can put this in Islamic terms, is that we all have been given different things by Allah. We've all been given different colors and situations and so on. And there are people who have more wealth materially than others.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who have more space in their hearts for others, a more secure upbringing maybe, or people who've worked through their traumas, or both. And when you're in relationship with somebody who's vibrating maybe at a higher level, or somebody who's worked through those things, then those traumas can begin to be healed. You can find healing in that. It's not the only way. There are many, many ways to find healing, but that's one of the ways. And the other thing that I want to share is that, a lot of people have spoken, and we do speak a lot in the therapeutic world about trauma and difficulty. And I do not want to underestimate that at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I also want to point out, and I think that we are not balanced in the therapeutic world in general in the way that we speak about things. I also want to point out that actually human beings can develop and do develop a lot of resilience, not just through therapy, but through themselves.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Sabnum, because I was going to come on to resilience. If I can just maybe pause you a little there and ask, because I think it will be a nice question to combine, and maybe you can answer all together, because I want to get through all the questions as it's really useful. So resilience, you said, and some people feel that having faith increases resilience, and there are also research about this lately as well. So I would like to hear your observations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of interesting research which talks about faith increasing resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it a really interesting topic. I would say that that's true, and I'll go into that in a minute. But I also want to just say, not for everyone.
Right.
Because for some people, and this is especially if they've been brought up with religion as a very fearful thing, that religion can actually be quite a frightening thing and quite terrifying. And people are very scared. And so it can actually, be a cause of trauma and difficulty. But having said that, there are also many people for whom faith does increase resilience. Now, with most of the research, it's actually coming from, I don't want to say a secular perspective, but it's coming from a perspective of like faith increases resilience. So resilience is the end goal.
Right.
It's almost like saying that.
Effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm not sure if resilience is the end goal.
That's interesting.
I think that sometimes we're supposed to be in difficulty. We're supposed to struggle. We're supposed not to be resilient. We're supposed to be challenged right to the edge of our capacity. And it's dangerous to feel that and to think that. As I say it, I'm kind of like, oh, but please don't do it to me. Because we're human, we don't want pain.
Of course.
But actually, pain is so important for us. Because through pain, through maybe not being resilient also, we learn humility. We learn that we are not the be-all and end-all of everything, that we can't totally depend on ourselves and our qualities, what we learn. Even we can't depend on our therapy or what we've learned through therapy. None of it is going to hold us through everything. We have to look beyond.
We have to look beyond. We can't depend. Sometimes we have to let go. And I guess also we have to sometimes look at our relationship with ourselves. Yes, what you're saying is beyond. I guess I'm understanding maybe with the look with our Lord, if we have faith. So if we look at it as we have different relationships, and these are with our Lord, if we have faith, with ourselves, with others, with other creatures, right? So often our relationship with ourselves isn't so well, I guess. When you talk about sometimes we need that pain, but the reason we run away from things and ourselves, mostly the reason we are on those treadmills is because we don't have such a great relationship with ourselves. Because if we do sit with that, it's going to be too painful. It's going to be unbearable. So I guess I can now ask you in that case, and I have been thinking about this a lot myself and reflecting on it. Loneliness and solitude. Sometimes people say, I love my solitude, but what does solitude mean? What does loneliness mean? So if we were to, I guess, look at it, there's different perceptions on these two terms. And I guess our listeners will also relate to this as well. And indeed, us too, right? Especially in these times. So we may all have experienced either or both during this period of social distancing and lockdown. So how would you describe the difference between loneliness and solitude?
I think you really sort of captured it when you said about our relationship with ourselves, and I would say with our Lord too, right? I can remember how I don't want you to feel really sorry for me, but it was very sad. I can remember how as a child I was very lonely and didn't have friends. And, one of the hugest experience of loneliness for me was being in the playground, surrounded by all those children laughing and walking from bench to bench, singing songs to try and keep myself company. But inside, I was very afraid of who I was, that I might not be acceptable to other people, that I might not be acceptable to life, that I wasn't somebody who could be loved.
What a painful place to be.
And that's loneliness, I think. It makes us so sad. And lockdown, has brought many people to this place, like, being in a boat with no ropes to hold it.
That's
And
such a metaphor.
You're confronted with the emptiness of yourself.
And that emptiness is such a hard place to be.
Yeah.
Being with that emptiness.
Yeah, it is. It's such a hard place to be, and yet it's a really honest place, I think. Because we also know that, that no person can really give us the kind of company that we're craving. Even if you're in the most delicious relationship, that person is not going to be able to give you that, and they're not going to be able to give you that consistently. So we continually experience loss. One of the saddest, phases in life is when people lose someone very close to them, very dear to them. They become widowed, or they lose a child, or they lose a love. Even if you're young and you fall in love and you lose that love, or you get rejected, it is so crushingly lonely. And I think solitude is where, you've made peace with those limitations. You've understood that you can't find these things outside, and you start to understand your own patterns, your own needs. You start to sort of see, like, oh, I was looking for this, but I was looking in the wrong place. And you start to go on an inward journey. Allah says that, in a hadith Qudsi, heaven and earth cannot contain me, but the heart of a believer contains me. So in our hearts, we have an understanding which goes beyond the confines of our own selves. And I think it goes beyond logic. It's like a meltingness and a deep comprehension of oneness that you can't acquire like we acquire other information, but you can submit to, and you can bow down to, and you can say Subhanallah.
As you were describing that difference, the difference in loneliness and solitude, with solitude, I already started imagining building that relationship with ourselves, accepting ourselves, and it felt delicious, as you said. We find that delicious taste in other relationships, but it's temporary, it doesn't last. But we crave for that constantly searching for that.
Yeah.
Yes, once we do turn inwards, and if we do taste that deliciousness with the solitude, I guess that will also be something that is quite addictive in one sense, right? And we won't be able to let go of it. And what you're talking about, the oneness and the submission and letting go, is so much working and so much growth there. But thank you for sharing your childhood memory, Sabnum. I guess when there are personal experiences, or when we talk about our histories, it does make more sense, and people do relate to it. Thank you. I'm just aware of time, and I want to make some time for questions as well. So we've been speaking about Islamic counseling. And I'm just wondering, um, how does Islamic counseling sit in the Western context? Because when you hear about it, it may sound like something that belongs to the East. But then here you are, the founder of Islamic counseling in the West, and it's also accredited, which is the best thing about it, and it's accredited by the Western Counseling Institution. So what I want to ask here is, and many people do ask this as well, as soon as people hear it, there's a misconception. Can a Islamic counselor um, provide counseling for everybody, or does it just have to be for Muslims? So how does it sit with Western philosophy and understanding of the human being in the context of suffering and distress?
It's a really good question, and I'll try and address it as quickly as I can because I know we have a bit of time pressure. I really like that you're in Istanbul, which is in the East and the West, asking the question.
That's so true. And also, hopefully, we will be in harmony by the end.
Hopefully. So, in terms of Islamic counseling, and in terms of the way that we see the model, I really reflect on that beautiful verse of light in the Quran, where Allah says, He is the light of the heavens and the earth. The example of His light is like a niche within which is a lamp. The lamp is within a glass, and the glass as if it were a pearly white star, lit from the oil of a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west. This oil would glow almost even if untouched by fire, light upon light. Allah guides to His light whom He wills, and Allah presents examples for the people, and Allah is knowing of all things. So, so that divine light, the light of knowledge, the light of love, all of these things, that divine light is universal. It doesn't belong to the East or the West. And when we founded Islamic Counseling, it was and it is really important that our methodology reflected those ayats. And I, to this day, use that ayat, and where Allah says that He's Rabbil Alameen, Lord of all the worlds, as a litmus test for what I'm going to share with students and with my clients. Does this sit with human beings? Does this sit with the children of Adam? If it doesn't, then maybe we're on the wrong track. I believe also that our model has something profound to contribute. And part of that is because it's a universal revealed teaching. And there is so much clarity in the model. And, I've learned from the best teacher. So I also feel that, that my life has been transformed by it. And I want to share that. And there are cultural differences in terms of who we are, where we come from, what our background is. If we're Muslim, if we're reverts, if we're not, if we're practicing, if we're not, if we're male, if we're female, what class we are. There are all differences, and a therapist needs to pay attention to all of those differences. But also, we need to understand that the human heart transcends all of those. We can see in COVID times, we can see who are the people who are besmirching the heart, the people who are degrading themselves. We can see how people have shamed themselves. And we can also see how there are people who have gone beyond, normal expectations. I mean, sometimes we see what's in a person's heart, but you can see these examples and they teach our hearts about, you know, who we can be, our potential, like I said. And I think there is a lot that is good in many of the Western models. And in fact, you know, like the East and the West doesn't really, they're archetypes, but they don't always make sense as separate entities because we're all from everywhere now, you know. And knowledge belongs to Allah, perfection belongs to Allah. So the kind of root is important, but it's not the only thing. I think sometimes as Muslims, you know, we want to remind people about our glorious Islamic past, and we want to challenge the cultural hegemony of the West, and we want to like put forward our stuff, you know, and that makes us feel good for a while, and it's a good challenge to some of the injustices. But I think we can end up being very nostalgic. We can end up just performing, you know, for the sake of others. And we lose the authenticity of just a real human being searching for truth.
I like what you said about if we can just stop being nostalgic and just start performing. That's so beautiful. So what we can understand here is that it's a universal approach, right? It's universal in terms of our working. We can work with Muslims, non-Muslims, people who have spiritual connection, no spiritual connection, any sexuality, any race, any culture, any faith, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
the training, if we want to link it to the first question, the training is for the therapist. It's for our own spiritual growth. And yes, there is a heart-to-heart connection. Yes, there is more to maybe mainstream counseling models because of the spiritual aspects. It does have more to it, but we work with anyone, any problem, and anyone.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, like we all have limitations, you
Sure.
know,
Sure.
and I wouldn't want to sort of say that all Western models are not spiritual. There's
Sure.
some that are also.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of beauty in this and
Yeah.
Universality.
Sure. Yes, that's what I like. That's the term I like. Okay, so just coming, we have about 10 minutes left. So my last question, if we can just maybe answer that and then go on to questions. There's some interesting questions as well. So do you offer any online training, CPD? That's
Yeah, so historically we've not offered online training because with counseling it's so important to be relational. But with COVID-19, obviously all of our work has gone online. So we're now looking at the development of more online work. We have to look into the accreditation for that because the counseling world is in general is not very pro online work, and I can understand why. But at the same time, I have a feeling that this place we're in now is going to shift things a little bit, and people are going to learn to work with this different culture. So there will be things, and people can kind of see them on our website and through our Facebook group. But I would also sort of say that I'm going to be doing a talk for online events, which is a mainstream sort of counseling library, I think the largest in Europe, where we've done talks for them before. And on the 23rd of June, at 10 o'clock, we will be giving a talk on spirituality and therapy. I think it'll be a kind of workshop type talk. Spirituality, yeah, and it'll be for everyone, so not just for Muslims. Discussing the theme of spirituality and therapy, and then we're intending to develop this course for COVID-19, which will be again completely online. And we're also planning, although I can't give you a date for that, we're planning a conference on Islamic counseling, where we hope to bring together different practitioners and speak about some of the work that we do.
That's great. I'm going to make a note of this and share later if anyone is interested. So those are all very helpful. And I do agree with counselling, especially, it can be hard. But I guess we're learning to adapt our ways of working, especially talking about East and West, coming from West, and also all these therapeutic models being, well, they have mainly started in the West. It's all Western models. I myself had to do a lot of adaptations, working with the East population, with diverse population in London and also here as well. So I guess it's a bit like that now, where we have to do lots of adaptations to the way that we are working. But hopefully we will get there, and it is quite promising that we can make far quite near us and have access to these trainings. So Shabnam, there's few questions. I'm just wondering whether we can just cover them all quickly. Is that okay?
Give it a go.
Yes, shall we? Okay, so if we can maybe spend 1.5 minutes for each. So could you describe a little how Islamic counseling works? We know basics of how CBT or schema therapy, etc. works, but when I heard Islamic counseling, it is an empty page for me. That's a really good question, I think.
So, I mean, I've spoken to some of the ways in which it's different, and I've spoken to how the training of the therapist is core. So what that means is it's not so much about what you do as who you are, and that's how it works. You know, you spend a lot of time in training, learning about yourself, reflecting on yourself, learning about tawakkul. And there is the Islamic counseling process as well within that. And what that is that you're really looking out for the tarbiyah of the person, but the therapist starts by orienting themselves, by really making a niyat that this is in service of the other person for the sake of coming closer to Allah. And then they still and empty their heart, and they continue to do that throughout the session. But at the beginning, there's a big orientation. And then the next step, which is really key, is about seeing the highest potential in somebody. And how we translate that is really about witnessing Allah's names in and through the relationship, through the session, in that individual. So you're really looking out for witnessing Allah in everything. And that is a really therapeutic thing to do. And the person starts kind of, you can often see with clients, they start kind of, you know, like lighting up and just responding. And then the next step, and you only have permission to do this step if you've done the other one, to see the pathology, to start seeing things as they really are, to understand, to meet them where they are. So then you're hearing the kind of specifics of the situation or the pattern. So that's really, really important.
I guess all of those early childhood traumas and experiences come into that. Someone else has asked, how would you, sorry, I just want to answer it in the same question. Where was it? I'm sure I read a question about that. There was a question, I don't know where I read it, maybe I just made up. How the early years experiences and traumas come into it. So I guess that's the stage we look at, those pathology you said.
Yeah, I mean, with Islamic counseling, we work a lot on the inner senses. And there are 5 inner senses, just like there are 5 outer senses. And the key ones that I want to draw on are the khayal, which is translated as the imaginal sense, the sense that allows us to perceive things, the creative sense, the visionary sense, but also the nightmarish sense, the sense that can fantasize about terrible things. And it's also the sense that allows us to believe in our world as it is. And then there's the waham, which is attributing meaning. So I have this, and I call it, well, you can't see it, I call it a cup. You know, because I've attributed it a meaning to it according to its function. And I would say, oh, this is my student, this is my friend. And that meaning can sometimes imprison us, the meaning that we give to things. And we store them in our hafidah, in our memory, and that's the third in a sense. And our memory, as you know, is not always faithful and not always helpful. So we have to work on all of those, and that's where that childhood trauma comes in.
Right.
And the earlier something is in our lives, the more impact it has, the more difficult it is.
Yeah. I found a question, but I guess you have answered it. It said, Islamic counseling sounds like it's all very positive and happy. How do you work with things like childhood trauma, pain, anger, loss? I guess it is answering that question. We have
I really
3 minutes left.
hope that I don't give the impression that, you know, we're just sitting there and kind of going, like smiley, smiley. You just look on the bright side, the complete opposite, you know, that it's really about diving into the reality of life, whatever that is. But where the therapist is really calling on Allah so that they can meet that in all of its depth, in all of its anguish, whatever it is. But also holding out belief, maybe when that person doesn't believe themselves, holding out belief that there is goodness in this. But it would be a nasty thing to do if somebody's miserable and in anguish, in pain, in anger, in loss, in trauma, to sort of say, well, you know, look on the bright side, you're going to learn something from this. That's horrible.
We don't do that.
And that's not what I think any therapist would.
No. Yeah. We just have a couple of minutes. I can't believe how time just went past.
Yeah, it really went quickly.
Well, there's a question about what are the most common problems you treat with Islamic counseling. I guess it will be everything. Anything that life brings to us will be the very quick answer to that, I guess.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, sometimes people come because they want to work on themselves. So it's not necessarily about a problem, but about self-improvement.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone asked they want contact details because they are interested in Islamic counseling. So we already have one person who's interested, which is great. And I'm going to note about all the CPDs that you have mentioned for people who are interested in to find out more. They can read Muslim. There's a chapter in one of the books. We can maybe...
Yeah, so we've contributed a chapter to a book called Counselling Muslims, which is edited by Ahmed and Ammar, and you can find it on Amazon. So on.
Yeah, yeah. So in that chapter, I guess they can read a little bit more about it, and then if they go onto the webpage, Islamic Counseling webpage, which I think will be shared in the comments, and they can also look on that, and also Facebook group you mentioned, Islamic Counseling Facebook.
Yeah, we have a lovely Facebook group as well, which is really nice with lots of members and some nice short bits of, you know, info there and sharing.
Yeah. Sabnum, I wanted to ask you so many other questions and I couldn't get through all of the questions, but we are up with our time.
Oh,
it's like everything we came to.
Nice. It's been so nice to share it, and I just really pray that you know, our conversation is of benefit, and inshallah that, you know, it's been some help and of interest to people out there.
Hopefully, inshallah. I have certainly benefited from it. Your presence and existence and your calmness always, that orientation you were talking about the first stage, it always gets transformed over, even from west to the east. Thank you all for listening to us at this time. It's late in Turkey, 11 o'clock now, I guess 9 o'clock in London. So if you like more details, please contact myself or Sabnum. We will provide those details. Do you have anything to add as a last word, Sabnum?
Yes, thank you so much, Yasmin. So lovely to be interviewed by you. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of the listeners and to those who put in questions as well. It's always nice to have that interaction. So thank you so much.
It was my first time interviewing, so apologies if I couldn't manage the time so well, but hopefully we will do it again.
Yes, it was lovely. I think everything important got covered. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure listening to you, Sabnum, and thank you for everyone for their time as well.
Thank you so much, Yasemin.
Thank you. Good night. Alaikum salam.